On August 15, 1991, in Plano, Texas, a suburban neighborhood just north of Dallas, a young girl, 8 years old, was walking with a friend toward their neighborhood pool around 6 in the evening. In the alley near Lake Hill Lane, a man stepped out of a dark vehicle and asked if they had seen his lost dog. When she responded, he simply said, "You're coming with me?" grabbed her, and forced her into his car. The girl was found approximately 5 hours later in Garland, disoriented, injured, and having endured a sexual assault. She managed to alert someone in a passing car and was rescued. That single evening marked the beginning of a case that would remain unsolved for more than 3 decades. Despite detailed composite sketches and descriptions showing a man around 6 feet tall with brown hair, mustache, and a heavy cigarette habit, no arrest was ever made at the time. The case went cold, but it lingered in the memories of the community and the minds of investigators. For years, law enforcement continued to hold on to preserved evidence, hoping that future advances in forensic science might one day shine a light on what happened. In 2004, investigative teams tested the evidence from the 1991 case at the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences in Dallas. The DNA did not match a known suspect, but it did reveal a connection to a similar assault in Dallas 6 years later, in 1999, a clue that indicated patterns worth tracking. This story reflects more than a cold case. It's about the lingering hope of resolution, the persistence of law enforcement, and the steady advance of forensic technology. In the years ahead, that preserved hope and DNA evidence would finally converge toward an answer. In August 1991, our victim was an 8-year-old girl residing in Plano, Texas, a community known for its safe, tree-lined neighborhoods and family-friendly streets. On that afternoon, she and her 6-year-old friend set out toward a nearby neighborhood pool, just like any other summer day. These moments, innocent and ordinary, are what make what follows all the more heartbreaking. Beyond the bare facts, little has been publicly shared about who she was, her name, her everyday joys, or her family life. That's a purposeful choice in official coverage. Law enforcement and media reports consistently withhold personal identifying details to preserve privacy and dignity, respecting her humanity while focusing on the case itself. That careful discretion tells us something. Behind the headlines, she was a real girl with a family who remembers her for more than what happened to her. It's also important to understand the setting. Plano in the early 90s was a growing suburban city just north of Dallas, home to families, kids playing in yards, schools bustling with activity. In that environment, parents trusted their children's steps outside to be safe. That familiar sense of security makes the abduction feel all the more shocking, because it shattered that implicit trust. Neighbors later recalled a sense of horror. Mary Peebles, who lived on the alley where the abduction occurred, said she and others were horrified that somebody could be taken from our alley, a place where they all played freely as kids. It wasn't just one family's trauma. It rattled the comfort of an entire community. Though her identity is withheld, the impact on her family endured. And the case left a void of unanswered questions that remained with investigators, the community, and her loved ones. The reporting remains fact-driven and unembellished, allowing the victim and the ongoing quest for justice to remain the focus rather than sensational details. As we proceed to the next segment, keep in mind, she was real, a child who deserved clarity and protection beyond that fateful day. Her family and neighbors felt a collective loss that lingered for decades. Official coverage preserved her dignity while highlighting the urgency and eventual hope of solving the case. The day of the incident. On the afternoon of August 15, 1991, 2 young girls, an 8-year-old and her 6-year-old friend, were walking toward a neighborhood swimming pool in Plano, Texas. It was around 6 p.m., daylight still bright, and the girls were traveling through an alley off Lake Hill Lane. That's when they encountered a man who would forever alter the course of one girl's life. The man pulled up in a dark-colored car and spoke to them, claiming he was looking for a lost dog. According to police reports, he leaned into the innocence of children, asking for help as a way to lower suspicion. Then, in an abrupt and chilling turn, he grabbed the 8-year-old girl, forced her into his vehicle, and sped away. Her younger friend, left behind, immediately ran for help, sparking the first desperate calls to 911. The suspect drove east, taking the child from Plano to Garland, a city roughly 25 miles away. For the next several hours, the girl endured what officials later described as a brutal sexual assault. Detectives would piece this timeline together from the girl's account, evidence collected afterward, and the witness testimony of her friend who saw the abduction. Around 11 p.m., nearly 5 hours after she was taken, the victim was released in Garland near a roadway. She was disoriented and injured, but still able to wave down a passing car for help. The driver who stopped quickly realized the seriousness of the situation and contacted police. Officers arrived, and the girl was taken to receive medical treatment and to provide details about her attacker. From her description, investigators developed an initial profile: a white male, around 6 feet tall, with brown hair, a mustache, and a noticeable smell of cigarettes. Using her memory, police released a composite sketch, hoping someone in the Dallas-Plano area would recognize the man. Plano Police Report, CBS News, Texas. Detectives also noted specific details about the abduction. The suspect's vehicle was described as a dark, possibly late-model sedan. He used the pretext of a lost dog, and he targeted children near a community space, facts that made parents across Plano fearful. Local news outlets covered the story extensively, urging residents to stay alert. Despite the trauma, the victim provided critical information. Her memory of the man's appearance and actions gave investigators their first lead. It was also her resilience, surviving the attack and seeking help, that preserved evidence which police would later re-examine using modern DNA technology. In those early hours after the abduction, Plano police canvassed the area, speaking with neighbors, asking for sightings of the vehicle, and distributing the composite sketch. Unfortunately, no arrest was made in 1991. Leads trickled in, but none led to the suspect's identification. The day of the incident left two immediate impressions: the bravery of a young girl who survived a horrifying ordeal, and the unsettling truth that someone capable of such violence was still at large. Plano, a city that prided itself on safety, was shaken. For the victim's family, the relief of her survival was paired with the haunting reality that her attacker was free. This day, documented through official reports and media archives, became the cornerstone of a case that remained cold for over 3 decades. Every future development, from the DNA testing in the 2000s to the genetic genealogy breakthrough in the 2020s, would circle back to this one afternoon in August 1991, when a child's summer walk to the pool turned into a crime scene stretching across 2 cities. The first investigation, 1991-1992. The abduction and assault in August 1991 launched an intensive investigation by the Plano Police Department. Detectives knew from the outset that solving this case quickly was critical, not only to bring justice to the child and her family, but also to protect other children in the community. Immediate police response. Following the victim's recovery in Garland, investigators secured medical examinations, which confirmed the assault and provided DNA evidence. At the time, however, DNA technology was in its early stages. The material collected was carefully preserved, but in 1991, it could not be processed in the way modern forensic labs can today. Police distributed a composite sketch created from the victim's description: a white male around 6 feet tall, with brown hair, a mustache, and a heavy smell of cigarette smoke. The sketch was circulated to the public, aired on local TV news, and printed in regional newspapers. Detectives hoped the image would spark recognition, from someone who knew the man. Leads and interviews. Tips did come in. Neighbors in the Lake Hill Lane area reported seeing a dark-colored vehicle in the vicinity that evening. Several men in the community who resembled the sketch were interviewed. Yet none of those interviews led to an arrest. Investigators also looked at registered sex offenders in the Dallas-Plano Garland area. In the early 90s, however, these registries were far less developed and often incomplete. Background checks, door-to-door interviews, and field questioning dominated much of the work. Forensic limitations. The DNA evidence collected was entered into CODIS years later, but in 1991 it was effectively unusable for quick identification. At that point, DNA testing could exclude suspects if directly compared, but the expansive genetic databases we rely on today did not exist. Detectives were limited to traditional investigative methods: sketches, eyewitness testimony, and canvassing. Even with those tools, the description of a tall white male with brown hair and a mustache was broad, too common in a city the size of Dallas-Plano. Without distinctive identifiers, police faced an uphill battle. Community reaction. The abduction deeply unsettled Plano residents. Parents became more cautious, children were supervised more closely, and neighborhood trust was shaken. Community meetings with police were held to reassure residents. Still, frustration grew as weeks turned into months with no arrest. Neighbors later recalled the atmosphere of fear. Families began warning their children not to walk alone, especially through alleys. For a suburb long considered safe, the incident served as a stark reminder that violent crime could strike anywhere. Why the case went cold. By early 1992, the investigation had slowed. Leads dried up. The sketch and vehicle descriptions hadn't brought forward the right suspect. With no physical evidence that could conclusively tie someone to the crime, detectives reached a standstill. Plano police kept the case open, storing the DNA evidence securely and maintaining the files. Over time, detectives would revisit it when new techniques became available. But in those first years, the limitations of technology and the lack of a direct suspect made progress impossible. For the victim and her family, it meant years of waiting without answers. They had to live with the knowledge that the man who committed the crime was free. For police, it was one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in their files. This initial phase is critical to understand because it shows why DNA and genetic genealogy would later prove so groundbreaking. The evidence was there all along, carefully collected and preserved in 1991, but the tools to unlock it would not exist for decades. The cold case years, 1991, 2010s. As the early 1990s turned into the late decade, the case of the 1991 Plano abduction and assault became one of the most frustrating unsolved crimes in the region. The composite sketch had produced no viable suspects, and DNA technology was still too limited to generate results. Detectives were left with carefully preserved evidence, but few ways to act on it, drifting into cold case status. By definition, a cold case is one where all available leads have been investigated and exhausted, leaving no immediate path forward. That was the reality here. Detectives had interviewed multiple individuals, canvassed the area thoroughly, and pursued every reported tip. Yet nothing pointed them to the suspect. With time, newer cases demanded resources. The Plano Police Department had to allocate officers to ongoing investigations, leaving this case in the hands of cold case files, archived but not forgotten. The DNA evidence was stored with care, marked as one of those rare pieces that might someday provide a breakthrough. Periodic reviews. Over the years, detectives did not let the case vanish entirely. Every few years, especially as forensic tools advanced, the file would be reopened for review. Each new generation of detectives looked at the evidence with fresh eyes, cross-referencing it with any updates in offender databases or new investigative methods. In 2004, investigators sent evidence to the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences in Dallas for testing. For the first time, DNA evidence from the 1991 case was compared with other profiles. While it did not identify the attacker outright, it provided something significant, a link to a similar sexual assault in Dallas in 1999. This indicated that the same individual was likely responsible for both crimes. That revelation reinvigorated the case, but without a name to attach to the DNA, it still stalled. CBS News, Texas. The human impact. For the victim and her family, the years stretched on with painful silence. They had endured a traumatic crime but were left without the closure of accountability. Family members pressed for updates whenever possible, and detectives often had to deliver the same answer. "We don't have him yet." Detectives who worked the case early in their careers carried it with them even as they moved into other assignments. Some eventually retired, but they often spoke about this case as one that haunted them. They had a victim who survived, they had DNA evidence, and yet justice remained out of reach. Community memory. For the broader Plano community, the 1991 abduction faded from daily conversation, but never disappeared. Residents who lived in the neighborhood at the time remembered it clearly, especially those with young children in the early 90s. A crime of this magnitude, an abduction in daylight so close to home, left a permanent mark. Occasionally, local media revisited the case, especially on anniversaries or when similar cases occurred elsewhere. Each story reminded viewers of the unanswered questions and the unknown predator who had once walked their streets. Holding out hope. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, DNA technology continued to evolve. By the late 2000s, cases across the country were being solved decades later using improved forensic methods. Plano detectives, like many others, knew the potential was there. It was just a matter of waiting for the technology to catch up. This persistence was crucial. Because the evidence had been carefully preserved, the case never truly died. It was cold, yes, but it was alive in the sense that someday, science might unlock the answer. By the 2010s, with genealogy and DNA databases expanding, the groundwork was finally being laid. Investigators were moving toward a time when preserved samples from 1991 could do more than sit in a storage facility. They could identify a family line, build out a family tree, and eventually point to a suspect. For the victim's family, that possibility represented something they had been waiting for over 30 years: closure. Forensics evolution. DNA enters the picture. When investigators collected DNA evidence from the victim in 1991, they were thinking ahead. At that time, DNA testing was still a developing science, limited in both scope and speed. In the early 1990s, laboratories could compare DNA samples if they had a suspect to test against, but they could not search vast databases the way they can today. The system most people now associate with DNA crime solving, CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, was still in its infancy. Texas joined the program in the mid-1990s, gradually building a state-level DNA database that linked to the national system. By then, the preserved evidence from the Plano case was stored securely, waiting for a chance to be tested under new standards. That chance came in 2004, when the Plano Police Department submitted the preserved evidence to the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences in Dallas. This marked a turning point. Analysts confirmed a DNA profile from the attacker and compared it against existing records. The results did not produce a name, but they revealed something crucial. The same DNA matched an unsolved 1999 sexual assault in Dallas. This was confirmation that the man responsible for the Plano assault had struck again. It gave investigators a stronger sense of urgency and a clear indication they were looking at a repeat offender. Still, the technology wasn't advanced enough to trace the identity. Without a direct match in CODIS, the case could not move forward. By the late 2000s and into the 2010s, however, DNA analysis was undergoing rapid changes. Laboratories were able to extract usable profiles from smaller, older, or degraded samples. What once required large amounts of material could now be done with just trace evidence. Even more importantly, the rise of genetic genealogy transformed how cold cases could be solved. Unlike CODIS, which only compared DNA against known offenders, genealogy allowed investigators to use public DNA databases to look for distant relatives of an unknown suspect. From there, skilled genealogists could build family trees, narrowing down suspects generation by generation. In the Plano case, the preserved evidence from 1991 was strong enough to generate a profile suitable for genealogy analysis. That decision by early investigators to collect, catalog, and protect every piece of biological material proved invaluable decades later. By the mid-2010s, detectives knew that a breakthrough was no longer a matter of if, but when. They had the DNA, they had a process, and all that remained was applying the newest techniques. This shift in forensic science, from exclusionary testing in the 90s to expansive genealogy in the 2010s, was the bridge that ultimately carried the 1991 Plano case from unsolved to resolved. The evidence hadn't changed. What changed was the ability to read it. The breakthrough: genetic genealogy. By the early 2020s, Plano detectives had a tool that investigators in 1991 could never have imagined: genetic genealogy. The method combined traditional forensic DNA analysis with the power of publicly available genetic databases, such as those people use for ancestry research. The process started with the DNA profile developed from the 1991 evidence. Detectives partnered with advanced forensic labs, organizations specializing in genealogy-based cold case work. Using that profile, analysts uploaded the sample to databases where individuals voluntarily share their DNA for family history purposes. Instead of looking for a perfect one-to-one match, genealogists searched for partial matches, distant relatives who shared segments of DNA with the unknown suspect. From there, experts began building family trees, mapping connections across generations. Each relative provided another piece of the puzzle, narrowing the search to specific family lines. This approach can be painstaking. Investigators and genealogists cross-check birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and public documents to identify who within a family tree could realistically fit the age, location, and description of the suspect. It's a blend of science and detective work, combining data with the human skill of elimination. For Plano detectives, the break finally came when genealogical mapping pointed them toward a name: Nicholas William Carney. Carney had been living in Grand Junction, Colorado at the time he was identified in 2022. He fit the description given decades earlier: roughly 6 feet tall, brown hair, a mustache at the time of the crime, and known for smoking. To confirm the lead, investigators obtained a fresh DNA sample from Carney. This was done legally, often through discarded items like a coffee cup or cigarette butt collected under surveillance. The lab compared that sample directly against the preserved DNA from 1991. The result was conclusive. Carney-S DNA matched the attacker S profile. CBS News, Texas. Fox 4 News, Dallas. When detectives shared the news publicly in 2023, they emphasized just how significant this moment was. After more than 3 decades of waiting, the case that had haunted investigators and scarred a community finally had a name attached to the crime. This wasn't the first time genealogy had been used to solve a cold case, but it reinforced just how transformative the technique had become. Cases once thought unsolvable because the suspect had never been in CODIS, never left fingerprints, or never been arrested, were suddenly within reach. Detectives noted that without genealogy, Carney might never have been caught. He was not a repeat offender in the system, his DNA was not part of CODIS, and traditional investigation had failed to bring him to the surface. Only by casting the wide net of genealogy were police able to find the thread that led directly to him. For the victim's family, this meant something even more important. After 32 years, they finally had an answer. For law enforcement, it marked one more success in a growing list of cold cases solved by blending science with persistence. The 1991 Plano case showed that genetic genealogy was more than a breakthrough. It was a revolution. The suspect revealed. When the DNA match came back in 2022, the name it revealed was not one known to Plano detectives from their original investigation. Nicholas William Carney had never been charged in connection with the case, and he wasn't someone who had appeared in their suspect lists from the 1990s. Carney was born in the late 1960s and would have been in his early 20s at the time of the 1991 abduction. Records showed he lived in Texas during that period, placing him in the region where the crime occurred. His physical appearance, 6 feet tall, brown hair, and a mustache, fit the composite sketch created from the victim's description. He was also known to be a cigarette smoker, matching one of the distinctive details remembered by the child and included in police reports. After the Plano assault, Carney moved on with his life, seemingly without attracting law enforcement attention. Public records indicate he later relocated out of state, eventually settling in Grand Junction, Colorado. There, he lived what appeared to be an ordinary existence. He married, raised a family, and worked in construction and maintenance jobs. To neighbors, he was unremarkable, blending into his community without suspicion. This is a common theme in cold case breakthroughs. Individuals who committed horrific crimes decades earlier managed to avoid detection by staying out of trouble, maintaining steady jobs, or relocating. Because Carney was never arrested for a qualifying offense that would have placed his DNA into CODIS, he remained outside the reach of traditional investigative tools. Plano detectives explained that without genealogy, his name would never have surfaced. Carney was not on their radar, not in their files, and not identified by any eyewitness beyond the victim's broad description. It took the family tree work, combined with targeted DNA collection, to bring him into focus. In 2022, Plano police coordinated with Colorado authorities to conduct surveillance on Carney. They obtained a discarded DNA sample, reportedly from items he had thrown away. The sample was tested against the preserved evidence from 1991. The result was decisive. The DNA matched. In June 2022, Carney was arrested in Colorado on charges of aggravated sexual assault and aggravated kidnapping related to the 1991 Plano case. He was extradited back to Texas to face trial. Court documents revealed that prosecutors planned to pursue the charges aggressively, noting the seriousness of the crime and the decades-long impact on the victim and her family. CBS News, Texas. For investigators, the arrest marked the conclusion of years of persistence. For the community, it brought relief that the man responsible was not only identified but also alive to face justice. Detectives described Carney as someone who had lived a normal life while hiding a terrible crime. That contrast between the ordinary exterior and the violence of his past underscored why the case was so difficult to solve. There were no obvious clues pointing to him in the 90s. He left little trail. It took advances in science to close the gap. As the legal process moved forward, the story of Carney's unmasking served as a reminder. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Even after 30 years, the truth surfaced, and a man who had evaded accountability for decades was finally forced to answer for his actions. Reaction from family and community. When Plano police announced the arrest of Nicholas William Carney in 2022, the reaction was immediate. For more than 3 decades, the case had been a painful reminder to the victim's family of a night that changed their lives forever. Now, at last, there was an answer. At a press briefing, detectives emphasized both the victim's resilience and the persistence of investigators who never stopped working the file. Plano Police Detective Jerry Minton, who led the renewed investigation, explained that the case represented years of determination. "This is a story of perseverance," he said, pointing to the victim's survival and the long pursuit of justice. Fox 4 Dallas. The victim, who has chosen to remain unnamed publicly, was described as relieved and grateful that her attacker had been identified and brought into custody. While she has not spoken extensively in the media, officials confirmed that she was informed of the arrest and felt a measure of closure after decades of uncertainty. Neighbors who remembered the 1991 abduction also expressed a sense of relief. One longtime resident told reporters they were horrified that somebody could be taken from our alley back then, and the crime left a shadow on what had been considered a safe community. With Carney's arrest, many felt the chapter had finally closed. CBS News Texas. Plano Police Chief Ed Drain noted that solving a case of this age required a balance of science and persistence. He credited the forensic genealogy work and the dedication of officers who refused to let the file fade. The department also thanked the victim and her family for their patience and courage through decades of silence. For the wider public, the story was both unsettling and inspiring. Unsettling because it reminded many how vulnerable children had been that summer evening in 1991, and inspiring because it showed that justice can reach across decades, powered by advances in technology and the refusal of investigators to quit. The reaction across Plano was clear. The arrest brought long-awaited closure, not just for one family, but for a community that had carried the weight of the crime for 31 years. Broader impact of the case. The arrest of Nicholas William Carney in connection with the 1991 Plano assault was not just a local breakthrough. It highlighted a much bigger story: the growing role of genetic genealogy in solving crimes once thought unsolvable. Across the United States, thousands of cases from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s remain open, often with preserved DNA evidence but no suspect identified. Traditionally, these cases stalled when the offender was not in CODIS, meaning there was no direct match to criminal databases. For decades, families were left in limbo. The Plano case demonstrates how those limitations are changing. By using genealogy, investigators no longer need the suspect to have a criminal record or prior arrest. Instead, they can find distant relatives and build out a family tree to identify the individual responsible. This strategy has already solved dozens of other cold cases nationwide, including high-profile examples like the arrest of the Golden State Killer in California. Forensic experts often point out that the key to success is not just technology, but also the foresight of early investigators who carefully preserved evidence. In Plano, detectives in 1991 collected and safeguarded DNA samples that would become critical decades later. Without that decision, genealogy would have had nothing to analyze. The broader impact also lies in hope. Families of victims in long unsolved cases often feel forgotten. Each announcement of a decades-old case being solved through genealogy proves that time does not erase the possibility of justice. Police departments around the country now actively review their cold case files, looking for DNA that can be retested or submitted for genealogical analysis. The Plano case also underscored another truth. Offenders who once seemed invisible can be found living ordinary lives, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Carney had lived quietly in Colorado, raising a family, while the 1991 case remained cold. His eventual identification shows that no matter how much time passes, science can close the gap between crime and accountability. In short, the case was not just a win for one victim and one city, it was a signal to every unsolved case across the country. With persistence, patience, and technology, the door to justice remains open. More than 30 years after an 8-year-old girl was abducted and assaulted while walking to a neighborhood pool in Plano, Texas, the man responsible was finally identified and arrested. The case stood as one of the city's longest-running cold investigations, but preserved DNA evidence and the rise of genetic genealogy brought an end to decades of silence. For the victim and her family, the resolution meant relief after years of waiting. For the Plano community, it closed a chapter that had lingered since 1991. And for investigators, it reinforced the belief that every piece of evidence matters, because science often catches up to what human memory cannot. The story of Nicholas William Carney is not only about one man being held accountable. It is about the persistence of law enforcement, the courage of a victim who survived and gave critical information, and the steady progress of forensic science. What began as an unsolved crime in the early 1990s ended as an example of how technology can deliver justice, even when decades have passed. This case reminds us that cold cases are never truly closed. They wait, sometimes for years, sometimes for generations, until the right tools arrive. And when they do, the message is clear: justice has no expiration date. For viewers, stories like this carry weight because they combine tragedy, resilience, and resolution. They show the darkest parts of human behavior, but also the power of persistence to uncover truth. Each solved case is proof to families across the country that answers may still come, even after decades of silence. As we close, remember, the preservation of evidence, the determination of investigators, and the rise of DNA genealogy mean that more stories like this will continue to surface. Cases once thought unsolvable are being reopened and resolved, one strand of DNA at a time. If you want to follow more stories of cold cases, breakthroughs in forensic science, and justice delivered against all odds, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue documenting these cases with accuracy, respect, and depth. Because in the end, these stories are not just about crime. They are about remembering victims, honoring resilience, and proving that the truth, no matter how delayed, still matters.